On April 11, 1970, NASA plans to send humans to the moon for the third time. Before this, NASA has successfully landed humans on the moon twice. NASA's team of people is keeping an eye on every aspect of this mission to make it successful. It has not even been a year since Neil Armstrong first set foot on the moon. 3 astronauts are sitting in this flat whose dream is to set foot on the moon. Everything is going well. They spend 3 days in this spacecraft and now they have reached very close to the moon, and after a few hours they are going to land on the moon. Their spacecraft is moving faster than a bullet, and suddenly they hear the sound of an explosion. As soon as this explosion happens, all the alarms inside the spacecraft start ringing. This explosion completely shook the spacecraft. When they look at their instrument panel, they come to know that an oxygen tank has blasted and all its oxygen is gone. And the oxygen of the second oxygen tank is rapidly leaking into space. These astronauts are now lost in space. They reach so far from the Earth that it becomes a new record. Now going to the moon is a far cry. Now the question is whether these astronauts will be able to return alive to the Earth or not. Truly, this story of Apollo 13 will shake your heart. Hello friends, I am Sham Tamar. I welcome you to this video. On July 20th, 1979, when Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped on the moon for the first time, it was a great achievement for humans. At that time, people were excited about this moon mission of NASA. The scientists of NASA landed the humans on the moon and also brought them back safely to the Earth, and exactly 4 months after this, NASA launched Apollo 12 and once again landed 2 astronauts on the moon. NASA's Apollo program was running very quietly. But now people had lost interest in NASA's Apollo program, and the government also started feeling that there was no point in going to the moon again and again. NASA's Apollo programs were costing a lot, and during those days America was at war with Vietnam. So the American government wanted to cut the funds NASA was getting for Apollo programs and invested in Vietnam. But NASA wanted its Apollo program to continue, and NASA had planned till Apollo 20, and NASA was busy preparing for Apollo 13. The main objective of Apollo 13 was to go to the moon and conduct scientific tests there, and to find out when and how the moon was formed so that the origin of the Earth can also be found. Like every mission, 3 astronauts were going to go in this mission too. The commander of Apollo 13 was Jim Lovell, and finally Apollo 13 was launched on April 11th, 1970. 2 lakh people had come to see this launch. But if we talk about Apollo 11, about 70 lakh people had gathered to see its launch. Now you can guess how much the craze of Apollo program had reduced among the people. Due to repeated visits to the moon, people thought that this was also a routine flight to the moon. That is why no channel telecasted this launch. This launch of Apollo 13 was successful, and now it will take them 3 days to reach the moon. Everything was going well. After about 55 hours of launch, Apollo 13 had covered more than half of the journey. During this, the crew of Apollo 13 telecasts live on Earth, in which they show how they are living in zero gravity. How is the Apollo spacecraft from inside? But this broadcast was also not telecast by any channel. During the mission, the crew of Apollo 13 remains in touch with the mission control on Earth. NASA's mission control was in Houston, USA. NASA scientists sitting in Houston were keeping an eye on Apollo 13 every moment. They were watching even the smallest activities and guiding the crew of Apollo 13 every moment. Before knowing what happened next in Apollo 13, it is very important for you to understand this basic structure of Apollo 13. This is the Apollo spacecraft, which is made up of 3 parts. The first part among these is the lunar module, and this lunar module will be used when the Apollo spacecraft reaches the moon's orbit. After reaching the moon's orbit, it will separate from the spacecraft, and 2 astronauts will sit in it and land on the moon's surface, and when the astronauts' work on the moon is over, then the astronauts will again sit in this lunar module and reach back to the Apollo spacecraft. The important thing to note here is that this lunar module has its own life support system. Through this, it will keep supplying power and oxygen etc. to the astronauts from landing on the moon to coming back to the Apollo spacecraft. This is the only work of this lunar module. If you look at it, the lunar module is the main Apollo spacecraft. It is made up of 2 parts, in which the command module is present. All the 3 astronauts going to the moon are sitting in this command module. It is through this command module that the astronauts control the entire spacecraft. It has all the computers and navigation systems installed inside it through which the Apollo spacecraft is in contact with the mission control from the Earth. You can call this command module the brain of the Apollo spacecraft. But the third part of the Apollo spacecraft is the service module. You can call the service module the heart of the Apollo spacecraft, because the service module works as life support for the command module. All the things that are necessary to keep the astronauts sitting in the command module alive, like electricity, oxygen, water, etc., reach the command module through the service module. This service module also has an engine installed through which these astronauts will reach the moon and set their path and come back to the Earth. You should understand that without this service module, forget about going to the moon, we cannot even return to the Earth. As I just told you, you can call the service module the heart of the Apollo spacecraft, and what will happen if this heart gets a heart attack? Something similar happened with Apollo 13. This service module itself stopped working. Actually, about 7 minutes after finishing the broadcast, when the Apollo crew was going to sleep, the mission control in Houston asked them to do an important task. Mission control asked the Apollo crew to turn on the fan in the oxygen tank and stir the liquid oxygen. Actually, stir means mixing liquids together. Actually, whenever a space mission is sent, gases like oxygen and hydrogen are sent in it after converting them into liquid form. The purpose of sending oxygen etc. in liquid form is that more gas can be filled in less space. Now the temperature in space is so low that this liquid oxygen starts freezing. So for this reason, a fan is installed in the oxygen tank with the help of which the layers of oxygen are mixed together so that the oxygen always remains in a uniform state, and this is a routine process which has to be done every time at an interval of a few hours. Mission Control asked the crew of Apollo 13 to do this routine process. As soon as Jack Swigert pressed the switch of the crater to start the fan present in the oxygen tank, a spark is generated due to a short circuit in oxygen tank 2 and oxygen tank 2 blasts. This blast is so strong that a panel of about 13 feet from one side of the service module comes out. As soon as this blast happens, all the alarms of the Apollo spacecraft start ringing simultaneously. Here, strange readings start appearing on the computers of the mission control sitting in Houston. Mission control was not able to believe those readings. Then the Apollo crew speaks to the mission control. There were 3 fuel cells in the service module with the help of which power was being supplied to the Apollo spacecraft. But due to this explosion, 2 of the 3 fuel cells were damaged. Now this spacecraft was getting power from only 1 fuel cell, which was not enough to keep the spacecraft running. After this, the astronauts faced another new problem. Actually, one oxygen tank was completely damaged in the blast, but the astronauts could see the reading of the other oxygen tank falling down rapidly. The astronauts were not able to understand what was happening, but then when they looked towards gym level, they saw that oxygen was rapidly leaking into space from oxygen tank 1 itself. The problem was that there were only 2 oxygen tanks in the service module, out of which one was completely damaged and the other was on the verge of being damaged. This oxygen was enough to keep the astronauts and the entire command module alive. The astronauts also needed oxygen to breathe, and oxygen was also needed to make electricity and water. Now in such circumstances, going to the moon was a far-fetched idea for the mission control. The biggest problem was how to bring these astronauts back to Earth. They were so far from the Earth that even if they were brought back to Earth, it would still take them about 4 more days. Will the astronauts be able to survive for so many days without electricity, water, and oxygen? And what about the freezing cold of space? How will they be able to withstand this, because due to the lack of power supply, the heaters of the spacecraft are also off and space is such a terrible place, where no rescue mission can be sent to save them, and even if such a rescue mission is sent, its preparations will take 3 to 4 months. Mission Control made a plan to bring Apollo 13 back. However, no one knows whether this plan will work or not. But apart from this, Mission Control did not have any other way. Now because the command module was of no use due to the failure of the service module. Due to this, Mission Control asked Apollo 13 to sit in the lunar module. But there was another problem here, that this lunar module was made in such a way that only 2 astronauts could sit in it for 20 hours. But now these 3 astronauts will sit in it for about 4 days and will use it as a lifeboat. To save their supplies and electricity, these astronauts get an instruction from the mission control to turn off all the unnecessary things present in the spacecraft so that power can be saved for re-entry on Earth. Drinking water was limited, so the astronauts were instructed to drink only 1 glass of water in the whole day. However, these astronauts can be brought back to Earth in 2 to 2.5 days. For this, the Apollo spacecraft will have to take a U-turn and return to Earth. But for this, they have to start the main engine of the service module, but the mission control was worried that no one knows how much damage has been done to the service module. Because of this, it may happen that the entire spacecraft blasts as soon as the main engine is started. Keeping this problem in mind, it was decided not to start the main engine of the service module, and a longer route was chosen to bring the Apollo spacecraft to Earth. This Apollo spacecraft will go to the surface of the Moon, and while orbiting behind the Moon, it will come back to Earth like a slingshot with the help of the Moon's gravity. Because when the service module exploded, the Apollo spacecraft deviates from its path. So first of all, the Apollo spacecraft should be brought to the correct path on which it can orbit the Moon and come towards Earth. So the mission control had only one way: why not start the engine of the lunar module and fix the path of the spacecraft? Although the engine of the module was not designed for this purpose, that it could be turned on and off again and again. But there was no other option. For the first time, the engine of the lunar module is turned on and the Apollo spacecraft reaches behind the Moon on the decided path, and the engine of the lunar module is turned off. Now these astronauts had come so far from the Earth that this creates a new record. These astronauts had reached more than 4 lakh kilometers away from the Earth. Till now, no one was taking interest in the Apollo 13 mission. But now Apollo 13 becomes a sensational news. As soon as the Apollo spacecraft orbits the Moon and is towards the Earth, the engine of the lunar module is burnt once again so that the spacecraft comes out of the gravity of the Moon and starts coming towards the Earth rapidly. Fortunately, the lunar module withstands this second burn as well. But the trouble was not going to stop here, because the lunar module was designed for only 2 people. But due to 3 people sitting inside the cabin, there was a quantity of carbon dioxide which was going out with every breath of the astronauts. Actually, the Earth's environment balances the carbon dioxide gas inhaled by us. But in Apollo spacecraft, lithium hydroxide canisters were used to balance this carbon dioxide gas, and the level of CO2 was kept under control through a simple chemical reaction. But the canister installed in the lunar module was made for only 2 people, which could work for a short time only. If the level of this CO2 was not reduced in the spacecraft, then these 3 astronauts would die in a short time. But fortunately, the good news was that there was a canister box installed in the closed command module. But the problem was that the canisters installed in the lunar module and the canisters installed in the command module were made by different companies. Because of this, the design of both was different. The mission control guided the astronauts from the Earth, and with the help of things present in the spacecraft, they solved this problem and the level of CO2 started falling. The scientists present in Houston felt that it was very important for these astronauts to sleep so that their brains could work properly, but it was so cold in the spacecraft that how could they sleep? Ice had started forming on the windows of the spacecraft. These astronauts were in a bad condition due to the cold. Somehow these astronauts come close to the Earth, but they still have to overcome one more challenge. Actually, while entering the Earth's atmosphere, it was very important to enter at the right angle. If this angle is less, then the spacecraft will collide with the atmosphere and bounce back and go straight into space, and then it will never be able to return to the Earth. This is exactly like when a stone is thrown at a particular angle in a pond. It starts bouncing on the water, and if the angle of this spacecraft is more, then the spacecraft will blast as soon as it enters the Earth's atmosphere. Right now, the angle of the Apollo spacecraft was not at all right for re-entering the Earth. Usually, during re-entry, this angle is fixed by the command module. But the command module is closed and no computer program was inserted in the lunar module to set this angle. Because of this, the astronauts had to set this angle manually. Some calculations were done by the mission control, and the astronauts were guided as to which engine should be started for how long. 2 astronauts handled the controls, and 1 astronaut was on the key, and the engine of the lunar module was started for the 3rd time. Fortunately, the engine of the lunar module withstood this 3rd burn as well, and the astronauts also fixed the angle of re-entry. Now the test of fire had come for the astronauts. For re-entry, they had to go back to the command module because only the command module was designed for re-entry. There was a heat shield on it. The good thing was that the command module was shut down much earlier to save power for re-entry, because of which the batteries kept in the command module had sufficient power for re-entry. Astronauts come to the command module and turn it on and separate the service module from the command module. When the service module is separated, so the astronauts saw how much damage was done to the service module. The astronauts also took some pictures of the damaged service module. Now the time had come to say goodbye to the lunar module which had saved the lives of the astronauts till now. Usually the astronauts put this lunar module in the orbit of the moon. But in this mission, this lunar module played a different role. Because of this, it had to be brought to the Earth and the lunar module also got separated from the command module. Now the last task of this mission was left, which was the most dangerous. This command module has to land in the Pacific Ocean where the US Navy ships are waiting for these astronauts. But the scientists sitting in Houston were worried that whether the heat shield of the command module might have been damaged due to that explosion. If this happens, then the command module will blast as soon as it enters the Earth's atmosphere, and the second concern was whether the parachutes of the command module got frozen due to the cold of space, and whether the parachute will open on time. Will they be able to reduce the speed of the command module or not? And the third concern of the scientists was that when these astronauts enter the Earth's atmosphere, contact with them will be lost for 2 to 3 minutes. Then how will they know what happened to the astronauts? Finally, the command module enters the Earth's atmosphere and the atmosphere starts showing its effect. The command module turns into a ball of fire and suddenly there is a communication blackout. The contact between the astronauts and the mission control is lost. It was expected that the astronauts will be contacted again after the next 3 minutes, but after 3 minutes there is no response from the astronauts. A few more seconds pass, but still there is no response. The scientists present in Houston, as well as all the people present on the ground, were holding their breath. 10 seconds pass. 30 more seconds pass, and another minute also passes, but there is no response. There is silence all around. After all, what happened to these astronauts? Was the heat shield intact? Did the parachute open on time? 1 minute and 20 seconds pass, but there is no response. Finally, for minutes and 27 seconds after the communication blackout, the astronauts are contacted. All 3 astronauts have returned safely to Earth. There is a wave all around that this Apollo 13 mission of NASA, despite being a failure, makes its place in the pages of history, and this mission gets the status of a successful failure. Even after this mission, the Apollo program of NASA continues, and Apollo 17 was the last mission when NASA went to the moon for the last time. Truly, the story of Apollo 13 shakes the heart, but about 60 years before this incident of Apollo 13, such an incident took place in the Atlantic Ocean, in which more than 1,500 people drowned in the lap of the sea in no time. The unsinkable ship Titanic had such an eclipse on its very first flight that incident shakes the hearts of people even today. You can see the story of Titanic in this video shown on the screen. I will meet you there.